Hi everybody, I'm Tim from troutandfeather.com, and as you can see we have a special guest on today's show. This is Mr. Jake Villwock of Relentless Fly Fishing. Jake, welcome back to the show.
Good to be here again.
I'm glad you're back, even though we're kind of in the same location as last time.
That happens.
All right, we're taking a time out from smallmouth fishing, and I'm picking Jake's brain. Today we're going to talk about steps to become a more versatile fly fisher, because geez, as you kind of get introduced to Jake, you'll realize he fishes freshwater, saltwater. He's kind of an expert in all of those locales. So we're gonna pick your brain on ways to become a more versatile fly fisher. Stay tuned. So this is the second time Jake has been on my YouTube channel. The first time we talked about basically fly line selection for smallmouth, because Jake is a smallmouth guy. Then I've kind of spent a day fishing with Jake, and I realized it's not just about smallmouth. He knows how to fish for trout. He spent time in Alaska. He has his own guide service. He fishes a ton of saltwater, and I realized while we're floating, like, let's talk about ways that people can become more versatile in fly fishing. So with that said, are you up for helping people just become more well-rounded?
Absolutely.
I know you are. All right, let's lead off. What do you got for them?
Okay, so first thing we want to talk about is understanding the food sources and kind of some of the overlap that you have with that. Now, you talk about trout fishing and nymphs, and those are kind of, in the sense of trout fishing, that is pretty much an exclusive deal. But you also have those same species, or I should say you have that same food source with, somewhat of a salmon, steelhead, things like that. So you do have overlap in that sense. Even sometimes smallmouth. I mean, you look at these smallmouth out here today, and they're rising to damselflies and blueing olives and some sulfurs and things like that, and so there is even overlap between trout and smallmouth. But one of the big things that I feel like people need to understand is that there are plenty of different bait fish that kind of overlap in all different species, but understanding what those bait fish do, where they are, how they move, and how to present that fly is huge. I have seen crazy similarities between smallmouth and snook, or smallmouth and tarpon in that sense, or even smallmouth and trout. One thing I will say that I've noticed, at least with freshwater in the sense of trout and even muskie to tarpon and snook, is that the speed is huge, and that slower kind of meandering bait fish or wounded bait fish is huge. I fish a lot of trout with some of my buddies that are not bass fishermen, and the first thing they always say to me when I fish streamers is, dude, you're not fishing for trout anymore, or you're not fishing for bass anymore, You're fishing for trout. Speed it up, speed it up. So knowing the bait that they eat and the reaction that that bait has towards that predator is huge. When you look at smallmouth and you look at snook and you look at tarpon even, or muskie, put that in there, you'll notice that like they are ambush predators. They wait a lot of times for the food to get close enough, and those fish don't want to chase that bait across the creek or across the river or across the ocean or whatever, out of the mangroves. They want to wait for that thing to get just close enough where they can pounce on it like a cat. Trout, on the other hand, they're going to run as far as they possibly can if they see something, and so knowing what those fish need is really, really important. And I think that is a huge tip to knowing how to step out of freshwater into saltwater, and how to step out of warm water into cold water freshwater, and kind of put that all in one kind of bucket.
All right, that's a perfect kind of way to wrap all this stuff up, because I have limited experience jumping from fresh to saltwater, but I can even think like I host trips to Iceland. I love to catch brown trout, but if I'm fishing for a brown trout in a river versus brown trout in a lake, there are completely different techniques that I'm using. There's different presentations, but most importantly, like whenever I get to Iceland, like I don't live there. I don't know that much. Even though it's my home away from home, the first thing I ask the guides, the first thing I ask the lodge owner, the first thing I ask other fly fishers, what do they like to eat?
Yep.
What do they eat? What do they prey upon? What's their food source? And once you have that figured out, then that means you can open your fly box, figure out what fly you're going to select, and then from that point start to say, how am I going to present this fly to them? Which I think might lead into our second topic.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's go with the second one.
Tim has his fly box open, and he's found the flies that he needs to use to catch these fish, but he doesn't necessarily know how to present that fly, and we kind of talked about that a little bit in kind of the first tip that we talked about. But one of the biggest things that you want to think about is knowing that kind of strike zone, how to present, how to cast, how you need that cast to land. I think the second tip to being versatile, if I had to put it in one sentence, would be presentation and your casting ability. And that would be something that's really important to know, because casting, there's lots of different stuff. When it comes to trout, sometimes you're just straight Euro nymphing, so you need to know how to cast a mono rig or a sighter, that type of stuff, not necessarily fly line. If you're fishing for trout in small areas, just like I've been into some snook situations, tarpon situations where you've got mangrove tunnels, and you kind of realize that all of those years that you spent fishing brook trout or fishing small creeks for little wild trout, all of a sudden you now have the opportunity to catch a 40-inch snook, but you have to cast the same way. You have to stay low. Sometimes you have to roll cast. You don't think about roll casting necessarily when you're saltwater fishing, but when you're in those mangroves, that needs to be part of what you're doing. And then of course you have wind that you need to deal with, and even smallmouth fishing, there are days when we've got 20-mile-an-hour wind coming upstream, downstream, straight across the river, and being able to know where that rod tip needs to be able to get that cast is really important. The third is that strike zone. Like, where do you need to get that fly in front of that fish to entice that strike? And sometimes for trout fishing you have to be 40 feet above that rising trout, put a bunch of really good mends, get a drag-free drift. But other times, like we've seen, when we're smallmouth fishing or sight fishing, poppers or bigger dry flies, you need to put that thing within 3 feet of that fish, because if you just let that float over top of them, they might not even notice it. They like that sound of that plop. And then when you think about that and you go to the saltwater world, you don't want to bomb a cast going, as fast as you possibly can and pile that line right on top of a tarpon. Right, you're in saltwater, it might be a little windy, but they can feel that, and so they don't necessarily, they're definitely not going to come chasing after that. You need that delicate presentation, and so with casting and presentation, I think is really important. And if you're doing it yourself, that's awesome, and there's going to be some growing pains with that, and you're going to have to really observe what's going on. But I've always found, being a fishing guide, and kind of without self-promoting and telling people, oh, you need to hire a fishing guide because he's going to make you better. That's not necessarily true, but what they do is they cut off a lot of that learning curve. And so asking your guide, okay, what are we trying to do here? And being able to put all of those together, I think is what's important.
Yeah, I think he hit this really perfectly, and it brings me back to like thinking about when I fish for beetles or fish with beetles for trout in the summertime. A lot of people think it's summer, you're fly fishing for trout, you want to make that cast above them. But one of my first casts with beetles, I'll make it behind the fish, because they'll sense that, they'll feel that. I have a tuck cast that hits the water, in a hurry, and those fish will just whirl and just attack that beetle. So you have to know what you're chasing and make that cast in that presentation. The one area that I really want to kind of drive home is that there are some casts that you're going to make, it's just like, this is your average cast, it's going to do great. But there's so many situations out there where you do have to become more of an intermediate to advanced caster. How do you do that? Jake mentioned you can check out a guide. Absolutely do that. And don't just go out with your guide and say, we want to catch fish. Say, hey, can we take a 10-minute casting session? I probably should have done that today. I didn't. However, understand that you have that option when you're with guides. Some other, kind of ideas that I have for you: record yourself. I mean, I think everyone out there now has a cell phone that has a camera. Set it up, record yourself casting, and just watch and see what are you doing that may not look right. And if you need something to compare it to, don't compare it to my casting, maybe Jake's, but go to something like the Orvis Learning Center. Check out their instructional casting videos. There is just a library full of videos to help you improve what you're doing. And then finally, check out some websites like, I think it's FFI. They have casting instructors all around the country. Yeah, you have to invest a little bit of money to pay for someone to teach you how to cast, but invest in yourself, become a better caster, become a more versatile fly fisher. Pause right now, go down and like this video just to reinforce that you enjoy whenever I have guests on the show. And then finally, before we get into this last kind of tip that Jake has for all of you, let me introduce you to this audience. So Jake is a smallmouth guide. He is the owner of Relentless Fly Fishing. I mean, he doesn't just fish for smallmouth. We're talking, he's been to Alaska, Montana, saltwater, as you've kind of heard. Jake, I know you've been on the show before. You've talked about your guide service then. Let me pick your brain, because I want to go down another avenue. You recently came out with a book.
Yeah.
Will you tell everyone about the book you wrote and just a little bit about that?
Sure. So it is called Smallmouth Bass Flies, top to bottom, but it's not just a fly tying book. We kind of took all three types of books. You got the tips and strategies, you got the fly encyclopedia, and then you got the tutorial book. And so we put all of them together. So there's 16 step-by-step tutorials from top water to mid column to bottoms. So it's broken down into 3 main feeding columns: top, middle, and bottom. And we did that because we wanted to kind of bridge the gap between trout fishing and smallmouth fishing. There's so many similarities to that we kind of wanted to show, hey, this is actually a very similar, freshwater predator to trout. So there's 16 tutorials. There's 340 plus patterns with just recipes, so photos and recipes.
You say 340?
340.
Okay.
I think the total
340 smallmouth flies in this book.
Yeah, so there's a lot. And then there's also a lot of information about how to fish, when to fish, why to fish, the different seasons, and when, what season do you want to fish topwater versus, only fishing, subsurface, things like that. And then different, biology about each one of the flies that we talked about and, what that fly imitates. So it's kind of an encyclopedia of smallmouth fishing, in general. And I learned a lot more about smallmouth while I was writing this book, which was really cool. I dug deeper into like some of the crayfish lifestyles or life cycles and things like that, and kind of opened my eyes to like, oh, this is when we should fish these. This is why we fish these. And I used to, not fish certain flies different times of the year, thinking, oh, they're not out. And then you realize their kind of life cycle, and you're like, oh, it all kind of rolls together. So learned a lot with it. Awesome book. And I'm, pretty pleased with, how it's been doing.
Yeah,
so
well,
far.
congrats on that
Thank
accomplishment.
you.
That's a really big deal. And for those of you interested in that book, look down below in the description of this video. I have a link down there, and I hope this is the first of many to come. Also, if you're into kind of fly fishing in Pennsylvania, absolutely check out his website. Consider booking a day with Jake or one of his guides. What's the website? How can people contact you?
So, website is www.relentlessflyfishing.com. There is a contact page on there, so you can send a note that way, or you can email me directly at relentlessflyfishing@gmail.com.
All right, now that we got that out of the way, last tip to become a more versatile fly fisher.
Knowing your equipment and its limitations. And I think that seems very basic when you think about it, but I have had, in the smallmouth side of it, I have had a lot of guys that have showed up with 5-weight rods because that's the only rod they have, which in some ways is great if you're fishing small creeks and you're going to catch smaller fish. But, we're fishing, a pretty big river, we're throwing longer casts, we're throwing bigger flies, and those fly rods just can't handle the distance that we need to cast. And so knowing what your equipment is capable of and knowing its limitations is huge. You wouldn't want to go catch a 100-pound tarpon on an 8-weight. That's just probably not a good idea. Likely you're going to break that rod and wait 6 months for it to come back. So knowing what you need and spending the money, I guess, would be one way I would say it. I mean, I'm not telling everybody to go out and buy a new rod for every single event that they're going to do. There is plenty of crossover with some of that stuff. 6-weights are a great example. 6-weights are good for trout in some aspects, and they're really good for smallmouth and even some light saltwater stuff. Knowing, like, when you're going into a day of fishing, what you're actually going to be doing and picking the right equipment for that is really important. And that also goes back to the fly line side of things. There's so many different fly lines now. I think Lefty wrote an article a few years back. He said when he started fly fishing, there were 4 different fly lines on the market. Now there's over 400 different fly lines. So knowing what you're doing and what that line needs to do will help you kind of hone down what you're looking for and that type of thing. So, knowing your equipment, knowing your limitations, knowing how far you're going to typically have to cast when you're going into a day of fishing, whether it's a guided fishing trip or you're just going by yourself, and picking the right equipment is huge for that.
And I love that you started off with like the 5-weight, because I have a whole video. It's probably, I'll link it on the screen right now, and it was basically saying how everyone always said the 9-foot 5-weight is the perfect rod. And I'm like, I haven't fished a 9-foot 5-weight in a decade. Like, I have no idea.
I don't own a 5-weight.
No, like, so it's like, sure, it may have been a perfect rod for somebody, but like, I have a video on what I deem my perfect rods. But my perfect rods are based on my styles of fishing. Jake's are based on his styles of fishing. Right. So we all have kind of those perfect fly rods in a sense, but I think what he's really trying to push to all of us is to say, listen, figure out the right equipment to get that job done. And it's great to say, hey, you got a 6-weight, you'll survive, but is it going to be the best rod if you're going to be casting in wind? Maybe, maybe not. Yeah, so really do your research, kind of, hone in, figure it out, and if you're in doubt, like, ask somebody. Who should you ask? I'm telling you right here, shoot him an email. You're always welcome to shoot me an email as well, just to say, hey, I'm trying to go to this location. What do you recommend? And if we don't know the answer, we're going to say, hey, we don't know the answer. Here's somebody who might. If you're into social media, be sure to use that hashtag Trout and Feather so I can see what you're posting about and I can learn basically where you're fishing, what you're fishing, the flies you're tying, all of that fun stuff. Come on, where do you think I'm going to get my future video ideas from? All of you with that hashtag Trout and Feather. But be sure to add Trout and Feather on whatever social media platform you use. I'd love to connect with all of you there.
So one side note to, fly lines and fly rods and being part of your equipment, that knowing what its limitations is. Another big thing that gets overlooked a lot is your actual reel. And in most instances, a sealed drag, large arbor is not necessarily something you really need. Trout fishing, even smallmouth fishing, most of the time we are hand stripping them in. We don't want to give them any extra. So having a reel that has that super bomb-proof drag system is not a necessity. But I have had lots of guys that have gone saltwater fishing and, not necessarily with me, but have come into the fly shop and like, hey, I'm going for tarpon, or I'm going for bonefish, or I'm going for peacock bass in Brazil or something like that. And they pull out this like old click and pull reel and like, this is what I had on my 8-weight, for fishing smallmouth. And I'm like, that is not gonna work. You're gonna blow that reel up, you're gonna lose your fish. So knowing the right reel for the job is also really important. And I think that, going to the $900,000 reel is not necessarily the importance, but the point is knowing like what that reel has to actually do. I will say the other thing that is just as important as the drag is the actual durability of the reel. I have fished all kinds of different reels, from Lamson's to Nautilus, and I have fallen back on hatch reels because I can literally throw one on the deck of the boat and pick it up and know it's going to be fine. So the drag, I would say, is very similar. I mean, I think it is a pretty bomb-proof drag, super smooth, but the overall durability of that reel is what sells me on that reel, and that's why I have those reels on everything from trout to tarpon, because it's when I pick that reel up, it's going to do what it needs to do. And there are plenty of different reels that do that, but I am horrible with everything that I own when it comes to equipment. And so if it can withstand a couple of seasons of my life, probably a lifetime in most people.
You heard it here, hatch reels.
Yeah.
Jake is into them without a doubt.
Yeah.
All right, well, there you go. Some information, some tips to become a more versatile fly fisher. Jake, thank you so much for coming on the show. Hey, this has been a blast.
Don't stop the fun yet. I talked about a ton of links and videos during the recording of this one. They're all right here in this playlist. All you have to do, click this playlist, let all that learning continue, enjoy all that information. It's for all of you. You can thank me later.